Welcome to The Critical Edition, a bookish podcast.
A show where we explore books and media and attempt to provide literary and political analysis about gender, race, religion through a critical lens. We are your hosts. I'm Soha.
And I'm Jasmine.
Longtime friends and book lovers. We'd like to debut the first episode of 3 in our monster miniseries, where we will explore 3 iconic monsters, their symbolism, iconography, and cultural significance in our favorite media and literature. Now let's get started. Today, we will be exploring the vampire. From hideous animated corpse lurking in the shadows to sparkling vegetarian 117-year-old virgin, we remain seduced by the vampire in all of their iterations. Maybe you've imagined yourself in a white nightgown holding a candelabra as you navigate a crumbling manor, or imagined yourself as the repressed, moody bloodsucker rising from their coffin. Chances are, if you found your way here, you're into blood-sucking, baby. Vampires both represent societal fears while also holding up a mirror to our deepest fantasies and taboo desires.
As the author of Our Vampires Ourselves, Nina Auerbach, put it, they inhere in our most intimate relationships. They are also hideous invaders of the normal. They can be everything we are, while at the same time they are fearful reminders of the infinite things we are not. Vampires and monsters alike are staples in the horror genre, and horror allows us to experience temptation, seduction, violence, and fear in very controlled environments. We can push and brush up against the religious, social, and sexual boundaries, while still retaining our humanity. Vampires, in deference to the supernatural, the non-human, are allowed to bend and break the rigidity of our ingrained morals, ethics, and values, and it can be a deeply cathartic experience.
If you're interested in a comprehensive cataloging of bloodsucker lore from the dawn of time, or fringe real-world vampire practices, as interesting as those things are, this episode is not for you. If you're interested in exploring what the vampire may mean as a symbol in literature and film, how they're born of and prey on human desires and fears, then this episode is for you. Most of the media we will be discussing are primarily from the West, which will inform the analysis given. Mostly, we're exploring vampire media that we have found interesting, compelling, or culturally relevant. Part 1. The making of a monster. The politicized other. You could certainly make a case, and a very compelling one at that, that vampires, along with very many other monsters, purport racist and prejudiced stereotypes.
I also understand why some people may not necessarily want to engage in this content, why this content is not only actively why they're disgusted by this content, but also why they feel harmed by this content as well.
Yeah, true. I mean, I'm sure sometime in my past I also felt that way. Mm-hmm. It's not like a necessary transformation to get over feeling that way. Mm-hmm. Like, if you feel that way, you have good reason to.
Exactly.
A monster is really considered a violent threat to civil, or let's say like colonial society. Mm-hmm. And they're accepted as symbols of prejudice. In the case of the vampire specifically, which we'll talk about in detail later in the show, but they're seen as an invader which is an allegory for immigrants.
Vampires are destructive threats that work by spreading their amorality, their destruction into other victims. And if those victims are not dead, then they become threats themselves as new vampires. It's a real invader mentality.
And I mean, there's a lot of Confederate vampires.
There are.
That's a real issue. That's a real issue.
It's also a real issue when you look at someone like the original Louis Dupont du Lac, who's somehow supposedly a very unique vampire for wanting to retain his humanity, but also whose humanity? Certainly not the people he enslaves, certainly not the enslaved people that he feeds on, not the enslaved people he kills because they were on to him and his vampiric nature.
I mean, Jasper from Twilight is notoriously known as very stiff and uncomfortable, but also as a Confederate.
Yes.
Soldier. Bill from True Blood is also a Confederate. Princess Weeks talks a lot more about this in one of their videos and talks about how this really serves as propaganda, like this lost cause war hero Confederate propaganda, which really might even illuminate some author bias, which recently we were talking about in Twilight.
Stephanie Meyer, what I don't understand your issue with indigenous people, with black people. Stephanie Meyer, who doesn't believe that vampires who, in their transformation, who become so ethereal because their beauty is a trait of their predatory, because their beauty makes them better predators, that as vampires in their transformation, they lose all blood, but they also lose all melanin.
It's like, what is going on? Yeah, so if you have an issue with vampires, certainly you have a very good point, I would say. They are created out of fear, the fear of immigrants, women, black people, people of color, people with disability, fear of the devil, fear of corruption, fear of losing order in society. Like, vampires are a manifestation of society's fears. But what society?
And I also understand that if in this society you already feel dehumanized, you don't need to empathize with monsters, with non-humans, in order to feel that dehumanization.
It's true that many of these monsters, whether deliberately or not, but sometimes very deliberately, were written through racist and misogynistic values that were even potentially present in the author. For example, Mary Shelley, though an abolitionist, she was also potentially an immoralist who only believed in the gradual emancipation of enslaved people because she feared an uprising. If you want to learn more about this, definitely check out Books and Cats YouTube channel, but more specifically, her videos, I think entitled, What Can Frankenstein Teach Us About Prejudice, and How Mary Shelley Wrote the World's Most Iconic Monster. And this is kind of similar to how Bram Stoker potentially felt about immigrants and around reverse imperialism. The fear that there were going to be immigrant invaders that would imperialize England. Men make women into demon-loving witches due to their fear about female sexuality and power. They all fear their place in society. They all fear for their place in society. They don't want it to be threatened. They fear rebellion and insurrection of the people that they deliberately have othered. They fear losing hierarchy and order and power, and therefore created these monsters that prey on society and who are violent and must be tamed. They created the other. The humans in these stories are sometimes, but not always, the ones with humanity. They're the ones we are meant to empathize with and to root for. like Van Helsing, like Blade, like Buffy. But potentially, in some narratives or through some frameworks that we can deliberately choose to read text through, there can be or has been a shift. Historically, while monsters have not been sympathetic creatures, and only now we look back at witches with sympathy by, reclaiming their stories. We get things like Charmed and Sabrina and Kiki and Practical Magic. The days of witches who use their magic against people and sell their souls to the devil are kind of like don't exist as much anymore. Instead, we sympathize with witches as having once been othered by the societies that they existed in. We can now sympathize with a vampire who's vegetarian and chooses not to harm, who's born of trauma, and is no longer an other but accepted in our society. We can see Frankenstein's monster, maybe always have seen Frankenstein's monster at least, as sympathetic, as wanting connection and seeing him as othered and feeling empathy of him being rejected. The making of a sympathetic monster is one that is well-rounded, that's surprising, and what early iterations, or maybe even prejudiced iterations, of these monsters lack, which is some level of humanity. Dr. Rosie Whitcomb, in her video essay about Frankenstein on her channel called Books and Cats, I highly recommend you check her out and check out this video. But she says reading a text, and she's specifically talking about Frankenstein, through a post-colonial lens is a difficult task that is often contradictory and hard to understand, which is why we must do it. I really resonated with like when she said this. I felt compelled to try to engage with some of these texts, some of this media, potentially a bit differently, even though it's a lot more onus on the reader or the viewer to potentially not look past, but interrogate, to question some of these things that we're noticing and seeing in some of our favorite vampire media.
I think that when looking into a piece of text, a piece of media or literature, binaries rarely exist, or I should say good media rarely have rigid binaries. And this binary may become blurred through deliberate readings of vampire text through post-colonial or feminist lens. New iterations of vampires and monsters that we have now are so complicated, complex, unique. We respond to them in many different ways. We hate them, we love them. Sometimes we feel very weird things about these weird creatures. There is a way, I think, that the vampire has transformed too, and with it, our ability to understand the monsters in new ways.
I think Octavia Butler's Fledgling, in particular, does some pretty interesting and complicated things with the vampire. Octavia Butler was an award-winning Black science fiction author. She often explored themes of racism and disparity through a speculative lens. Some other notable publications she authored are Parable of the Sower, which explores climate change in an apocalyptic setting, and Kindred, which explores time travel and contemplates issues like slavery and prejudice. Fledgling was the final book Butler published in 2006 before she passed. Octavia Butler's official website has this to say about Fledgling. Fledgling is the story of an apparently young, amnesiac girl whose alarmingly inhuman needs and abilities lead her to a startling conclusion. She is, in fact, a genetically modified 53-year-old vampire. Fledgling is a captivating novel that tests the limits of otherness and questions what it means to be truly human. Our protagonist in this story has the body of a 10-year-old Black girl, but is in fact a 53-year-old vampire. Some notable points in this novel are that her melanin allows her to walk in the sun, and additionally, she engages in a relationship with Wright, a 20-something-year-old construction worker. She bites him, and her venom bonds them, which sort of obscures agency and power. Florian Bass, in their piece I Won't Always Ask, Complicating Agency in Octavia Butler's Fledgling, talks a bit about not only the discomfort that the audience feels reading about the events that are unfolding in the text, but also examines agency and oppression. And basically, the novel's refusal to accept simplified categories of oppression and agency. And I quote, "This is not to say that the novel simply poists a complete reversal of power roles. It rather tries to deconstruct simplified binary views of oppression and agency. Power fields become so tangled that they discourage simplistic categorizations of dominant or subordinate, yet they do not deny the existence of such positions." I guess what it is that we're trying to say is that if we choose to engage with these texts through particular frameworks, we may be able to consider our own views, our own prejudices. They, specifically with the vampire, they might make us consider religion, sex, sexuality, immigration in a totally new way that can be compelling and interesting and alluring and seductive. These monsters, vampires, have been so enduring, potentially because of what they say about us, how we view them, how we treat them, whose imaginations were they created through? In what ways is this society afraid of them, and why?
Part 2. Religion, Sin, Sexuality, and Eternal Damnation. I think that what makes vampires so fearful, especially in the earlier imagination, is that vampires often work the way sin was thought to work. Vampires are these creatures that tempt humans. They offer pleasure, and they spread their contagion throughout the population, decimating anyone who dares to fall for them. There's some obvious evidence, I think, to support this. One being that vampires are often barred from the church as a physical boundary. Vampires are also barred from the home unless you invite them in once. And I think that reflects how sin was thought to work. That sin, you let one in, and it kind of snowballs into eternal damnation.
That's surely how we were taught, at least.
Maybe this is not universal. But this is, I think, not uncommon.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that the threat of the vampire itself is the threat of a human succumbing to this mysterious, powerful force. But that's also kind of the allure in it. When you fall for this powerful force, you're kind of absolved of the agency it takes to commit sin. I think that it makes you kind of question and ask, who is susceptible to sin? And it would be Eve. And why does Eve fall? Because she's weaker than Adam. And when Eve falls, that's when she's able, or I suppose that's when Adam becomes fallen as well. But like with Adam and Eve, there is redemption. There is a chance for them to reach paradise again. And I think that that is kind of reflected in the transformation of vampire from sinner to redeemed. I think that maybe what is so alluring about vampire media right now, what is really prevalent in the last few decades is that vampires hate what they have become. They want redemption. They want to be loved ultimately, I think. And I think that maybe me personally, it reflects my own desires of wanting to be loved despite being an inherently sinful creature, a sinful woman even. I think that vampires prior to that transformation were very much a threat. But they also are threats not because of the physical danger that they pose, but because of the possibilities of their subversive nature. For example, vampires do not adhere to the same family structures that our society, that our colonial society, our capitalist society is built on. Vampires, their family units is much more fluid than what we might conceptualize as family. They exist in covens. Dracula and his 3 brides. This is a very, maybe not the best example of a polyamorous relationship, but it was an early one. Another famous coven, I think, maybe the most famous coven, the Cullens.
They have really unique family structure.
So unique. They're not tied by obligation. They're just people with the shared identity and pitted against 2 very hostile worlds. Like the humans represent a very hostile environment. They are othered in this one. But their fellow vampires hate them because they see them as these self-repressed freaks who are denying their very nature, their very gifts even.
And when Anna Kendrick said, like, oh, they're all like siblings, but they're together.
That's
basically saying, yeah, it's a different type of family structure. They don't really adhere to, you know, what under like a colonial capitalist society defines as the nuclear family. Yeah.
For example, like, even though one might argue that Carlyle is the coven master, leader, father, patriarch, even though he doctor, even though he kind of occupies this leadership position, he is not the most powerful vampire of them all compared to someone with very unique abilities like Edward, who can read minds, with Alice, who can see into the future. They nominally elect him into this leadership position because they genuinely respect his character.
Well, and I would say because the only tie or obligation like a vampire might have to another is through the maker and child. And Carlyle is like their maker, right? He made all of them. But it like that relationship isn't like always it's sometimes sexual.
With Esme.
Right, with Esme it was sexual. Edward turned Bella, and that's like sexual, although that was a weird scene. But it's also like it can be parental between Carlyle. Yeah, I mean, like, but Carlyle and Esme, it's sexual. Carlyle and everyone else is not sexual. It's, like, more familial.
Yeah. And also, like, there is this weird, like, incesty undercurrent that we were kind of exploring earlier. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that the way that they band together, they're through choice.
Sometimes.
Right? Sometimes.
Because sometimes vampires are not created through choice.
Through choice, absolutely.
Right. But if you choose to stay together, I think that is through choice. Right?
I think that this coven idea as like family is very expansive. It's fluid. It's can be seen as how immigrant communities can work.
But they still have like vampire morals.
Oh, absolutely.
In the creation of their families.
Yeah. And I think their morals is what keeps the coven At least with the Cullens, this is kind of what keeps the coven together. Maybe it's like their most defining trait.
Right. And that's why they're so like worried about the vampire baby, because like vampire childs are like you shouldn't do that.
And I think it's interesting that the vampire child is a taboo even amongst the taboo-ness of vampires in multiple media iterations of vampires. Like even they know that's a line that they cannot cross.
Yeah. Where we usually think of vampires as like totally depraved. They have no sense of morality, no humanity. But here's this way that they're showing morality and humanity.
Another very famous vampire family unit, Louis Dupont du Lac, Lestat de Lioncourt, and Claudia.
Yeah. Stepdad Armand with also there.
What is it? Queer parent Lestat, queer parent Louis, queer stepfather,
queer
child.
It's because I think vampires don't, like, they kind of represent everything that you assume a very delicate Victorian white society fears. And in this case, it's being gay. Okay, they're afraid of being gay, and so there are a lot of like gay vampires. Even like some of the most early vampire texts, gay.
Carmilla, maybe the prototype, if I'm being controversial, to Dracula.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the author of Carmilla and Bram Stoker, like I think worked at the same newspaper, and they were published within 30 years of each other. So like I don't know, I think sure he got some ideas.
Absolutely. But like Carmilla, this is a woman vampire seducing women victims in very, I would say, very sexually charged way.
Absolutely. And I think that like while, again, this like very demure Victorian colonial white supremacist society, like all of their fears are projected onto the vampire. They're afraid of queerness. They're afraid any sort of transgressions in sexuality. They view it as sinful. But the vampire doesn't really care at all about that. And that's what makes them so scary, is because they don't really have guilt or shame to keep you sort of
obedient, subservient,
right,
in line.
I think it's also interesting that, you know, in the case of like Carlyle and his, would you call Esme his child? But like, I don't know. And his children, the vampires that he made, or fathered. But okay, anyways, with the exception of maybe Carlyle, that a lot of vampire children are sort of like left to their own devices to figure out their vampire identity to some degree. I mean, they're sort of like shown around for the first day. Hey, drink blood. Hey, sleep in the coffin. But then it's sort of like, as a family, they kind of value independence, which I think is interesting.
When we ask ourselves why there are so many instances of queer vampires, gay vampires, I think it's important to remember that these are creatures of the night who are already promised eternal damnation, and what is one sin counted against a lifetime, multiple lifetimes of sinning. Eternally damned, I don't think, fear the religious consequences of sexual deviancy, the way people bound by religion do. But I think something that is like very interesting that both vampires and queer human folk encounter is this problem of recognition, this problem of both passing and masking. The way the vampire myth works is that it often involves a story or a narrative structure in which their existence remains secret, that there is this tension between knowing and not knowing. Can you recognize a vampire in front of you? Can you recognize this threat? Will they find out? Mingling amongst normal, respectable people. Vampires can walk amongst the living. They can even pass for the living. They are straddling both worlds, having to hide their identities, often like queer folk do when society is violently hostile towards them. And you can also read this through like an immigrant lens, this having to straddle both passing and masking, while also knowing that you are in an environment where it's not safe to be open. I think this is similarly related to how vampirism is often used as an allegory to HIV/AIDS. And you can see this in some vampire media like Coppola's Dracula. There's this fear aspect of contracting the contagion, the fear of being turned or victimized. And this is obviously tied into purity culture, homophobia, religion, your status, whether that be your status as a vampire or human, your HIV status. These things are moralized, framing your illness as a consequence, as oppositional to the dominant sexual and religious values. In this way, the vampire functions as a suggestion to those who are living with HIV/AIDS or otherwise marked as diseased should be banished or feared or eliminated, slain even. And there are some very visual, very tangible ways in how this allegory works. For example, the vampire's reliance on blood as a source of sustenance and the potential for transmission. The vampire's portrayal as othered or marginalized figures mirroring the experience of people living with HIV/AIDS, particularly during the early years of the epidemic where there was a lot of stigma and fear. And I think most importantly, the vampire can represent the fear of this mysterious threat, this mysterious, uncontrollable illness. That was similarly how HIV and AIDS was initially perceived. This is, I think, not necessarily unique to the vampire. There are some other monsters who, like the werewolf, who often share allegories in this HIV/AIDS crisis.
A lot of this is tied together with the idea or concept of invasion with HIV and AIDS. Invading your body, it's like a disease. With immigration, it's an invasion of land, and one could also say like racial purity. And even with religion, like vampires are seen as like the sin itself, like they're invading pious, moral, good Christian people.
So how do we get this transformation of vampire from sinner, from monster, from evil to viable, sexy love interest, to someone who can be and is loved in the popular imagination? I think that vampires, first and foremost, compared to other monsters, had this really unique ability to mimic humanity, not only because they were born humans, but because they were able to hide their monstrosity, sometimes physically, sometimes more than that. Humans, to some extent, are able to do so as well. I mean, if we as humans can love undead, non-human vampires, and we can also love, maybe, the most monstrous human amongst us, the most flawed human amongst us.
Or even ourselves, because we have like monstrous, terrible thoughts at times, right?
Yes. And like vampires, I don't think that's their defining, that's not all that they are. It's not how they must define themselves.
Right, because like monsters these days have more humanity, choice, which some people would say like, oh, you're taking the monster out of the monster. But I would argue that you're like writing a more well-rounded character.
You're complicating the monster, just like the way we are all complicated. Human monsters that may have inspired Dracula. Maybe the most well-known, Vlad the Impaler. His cruelty is notorious, infamous. Maybe someone not so infamous is Elizabeth Bathory, the Blood Countess, this Hungarian noble serial killer who killed and targeted hundreds of young women and girls, maybe to bathe in their blood, to maintain eternal youth and beauty. Maybe not.
She was real.
She was real.
Oh boy.
And we're still so fascinated by these two monstrous, violent people. I think maybe that says something about us too. But it's hard to make a viable love interest out of someone who is so flattened to just be evil and monster. I'm sure we can still love them if they're evil and monster, maybe because they are, and that's offers something different. But in romance, we need figures that we can sympathize with. Someone who's maybe on the precipice of good and evil. Maybe evil only because that's how they are. That's in their nature. They can't help doing what they need to do to survive. And maybe evil and good complicated because they were maybe potentially victims too. Maybe they didn't have a choice in their transformation. And these vampires, I think, are especially compelling because they're often characterized by this melancholiness, their emo-ness. They can't seem to look past their pain, and we get vegetarian vampires out of them. They are people, they are vampires who deny their very nature. It reads as self-hatred. It reads as being desperate for redemption. And I think that even the damned want redemption. They want to be loved. And vampires, I believe, in the popular imagination, the way we view them now, are worthy of love. They are able to overcome their sins, their traumas, their pasts. They seek salvation. And I think that whether you're religious or not, there is a desire to be saved, maybe. Whether by a higher power or not, that's, I don't know, different people's prerogatives.
You first see the vampire as a tragedy, and then they can become a hero.
And then they become the hero of their own journeys. But also, like, in a Byronic sense, like, capital H hero. These Byronic, romantic, and lowercase r romantic vampires. Something that seems to be a prerequisite in order for them to become very viable romantic interests is that they must be sexy. And maybe not sexy, well, maybe sexy the way Ian Somerhalder is sexy, but sexy in the sense that they're not like averse to garlic. They're not repelled by garlic. They're yeah.
They're not like a big beast.
No. Although maybe there's something sexy in
that's sort of like a different episode.
But they're sparkly. They're beautiful. But I think what makes vampires as not just viable romantic interests, but even like compelling and more interesting is that because they're vampires, there's ample space for them to have this capacity for darkness, this capacity to sin.
It's like when they do sin, it's like, oh, well, that's just your nature. You can't help it.
Yeah. But it's also kind of this acknowledgement that sin does exist in you. Like the way sin exists in all of us. But instead of trying to obscure it, instead of trying to hide it and pretend it doesn't exist, we recognize that the vampire holds space for both goodness and also for depravity, maybe.
And I like this quote: whether you call someone a hero or a monster is all relative, to where the focus of your consciousness may be.
Yes, Campbell and Moyer.
1998. Very timeless.
Very timeless.
But it's true.
It's true. I think the lens that we view vampires is situated in the lens we view ourselves, the lens we view the world, the lens in which we view the society that has created these monsters. It parallels a human's journey from sinner to redeemed. In the New Testament, John describes how all people have this darker side, or the sin, and he says, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. And it's true that there are different ethical standards for vampires and humans. There's a sense of how far away from human vampires are able to get from, despite the fact that they are all born humans. Vampires that yearn to be human or retain their humanity are characterized by constant struggling and repression. Carlyle, Edward, and Louis are this way, and it makes them romantically viable partners, not just for other vampires, but especially for humans.
Now let's talk about the sin that is vampire romance.
Ooh.
So, we're familiar with the vampire girlfriend.
Absolutely.
We all know her.
I wanted to be her.
And many of us don't love her. But we do want to be her.
Yeah.
In ContraPoint's Twilight video, she makes some really interesting points about the allure of the vampire-human romance relationship, where, you know, typically the vampire's always a man. Ugh, I don't know. Well, that's something to explore for sure. But she talks about how, like, the allure of that relationship partly is that the vampire's dangerous, seductive, sinful. She shouldn't be doing it. But he's literally otherworldly, and he's into you. Which, by virtue, makes you super desirable. It's like you become desirable by your proximity to your vampire boyfriend. In that video, she shows this scene of, like, Bella and Edward, they, like, finally become an item, and they get out of their car in their high school, and they're, like, walking in the parking lot, and everyone's looking at them.
Oh, yeah.
And she's like, that's it. That's the social desirability that Bella wanted, basically. Because you could argue that in Twilight, Bella's the other.
Yeah.
I mean, Edward's, like, sure, he's the other too, but, like, she's
the new kid on the block. She's
she's awkward.
She's awkward, quirky.
Yeah.
She's quiet, bookish.
Very much so. But also she's white.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
I think that they even describe her as, like, half albino.
Oh my god, you're so right, they do. Oh.
That's that racial purity at play.
Oh, yeah. They do that. Stephanie Meyer has a sort of, like, recurring issue there. Also, in that ContraPoints video about Twilight, which, you know, you definitely should watch, is super interesting. The production value is, like, you know, better than what we're doing here. But the fact that the vampire is hunting her, like, there's literally the predator and prey dynamic, relinquishes her of shame, of guilt, also sometimes of agency and choice. But with that, the shame and guilt peel away. It's like it sort of falls within the whole bodice ripper genre. It's like you want someone to pursue you so bad, so hot, that they literally rip your corset off, right? And she talks about that in that video too, but it's like it absolves you of sexual guilt that we're so steeped in. And you could call this a Christian nation that our values are heteronormative, patriarchal, and expressing, especially as a woman, sexual desire invokes this like religious guilty feelings.
While also absolving the vampire girlfriend of this guilt and shame, it's also fulfilling this often economic fantasy, this idea that this probably rich, always older man will whisk her away from the normal life she leads into something that is unfathomable, something that she can't even imagine beyond her wildest dreams. For someone like Bella, who grew up in like a single parent household, very middle class, one could even say working class, swept away by the Cullen family in their glass house, meeting their sister, who's able to somehow foresee the stock market. That's that capitalist fantasy at play, I think, in Stephanie Meyer's work. But we're digesting that through Bella in this first-person narrative. But those desires are kind of eclipsed by the
Eclipse.
Yes. But those like economic desires are, I think, largely eclipsed, overshadowed by just this overarching desire to be desired, to be wanted, to be craved, enough to sustain someone's entire existence, enough to shake this person's existence who's lived through multiple lifetimes.
It's like, how many women has he probably met in his lifetime, seen in his lifetime?
Too many.
But it's me.
But it's me.
Yeah. And do they ever feel like very insecure about their standing in their vampire boyfriend's life? It doesn't really seem like it.
Right? I think that would break the fantasy.
That's true.
I think that would definitely make being a vampire girlfriend unappealing. And these works, I don't think that's what they're about. I think they're just kind of playing into our...
It's the fantasy of the...
Yeah.
Yeah. He's dangerous, but not to her.
Yeah,
Like,
she's special.
She's special, and you could definitely read it through a lens where it's an allegory for an abusive relationship. And at times, like, that might even be the intention of the piece, to explore that exact dynamic. Though, again, referring to the ContraPoints Twilight video, it's not always literal.
Mm-hmm.
She encourages us to view things more psychologically and more metaphorically.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the psychological processes that are happening when agency and choice are more dubious?
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting when you consider who can be the vampire girlfriend, or who often is the vampire girlfriend in these pieces of media and text and literature. Often the vampire girlfriend is white and pure, and virginal is very important. And those integral parts of her is the reason why she cannot necessarily she cannot pursue the desire that she may hide for the vampire boyfriend. That's why she must feel that she must be swept up in this through his power, through his coercion, through his seduction and temptation.
Yeah, the vampire girlfriend is often pure, both sexually, but also often racially. Ugh, yeah, yuck. Racially pure, and she like really represents white womanhood. And again, like, the vampire is meant to threaten this, liberate this, subvert this. That just really depends on how you read it. But nonetheless, I think the vampire girlfriend represents a certain type of white womanhood that they're telling us that the only type of woman who's desirable is a white woman. And the vampire also only really preys on white women as the objects of their fascination and obsession, their love, their romance, who they're intertwined with. And then everyone else is sort of just like,
Expendable.
exactly. But it's really the white woman
Special.
is special. She's really at the center of a lot of this, the creation of the vampire, which we'll talk about in part 3. Part 3. The vampire, the immigrant.
Victorian anxieties, immigration, and the new woman. So the vampire, I think, is always an outsider, spatially, geographically. Vampires are othered, and they walk a similar path to immigrant narratives. And I think it's really interesting to explore vampires through this lens as an immigrant, as a child of immigrants. And it's so cool when you consider that many of the original and most prominent vampires are indeed immigrants themselves. For example, Count Dracula, hailing from Transylvania, speaks with a distinctly Eastern European accented English, which has almost become synonymous with the vampire itself. His accent is unique amongst or amidst the backdrop of English society. In other words, his accent is easily and immediately distinguishable to anyone and everyone he encounters, which is othering. There are many ways that the vampire threatens civil society or white colonial society, one of which is through his accented English.
During the time that Dracula was written, which what, 1870s?
1897, I think.
1897, there it is. During the time it was written, there was sort of this anxiety around immigration, specifically around Jewish people immigrating into England. And I feel like the anxiety around immigration is still very real and true today, especially under our current administration. There's a lot of fear that people who are immigrants rightfully have right now. And it's because of this administration sort of espousing really kind of disgusting rhetoric about the threat that immigration poses to American society, which, I think is somewhat similar to potentially how Bram Stoker felt, or at least through reading Dracula, that's what we can pick up on. How immigrants sort of represent this decay in society. Like if we viewed Count Dracula as the immigrant, he's sort of a threat to their society as a vampire, but also as an immigrant, morally, racially, and sexually. He sort of threatens their society by white supremacist and colonial standards because him, as well as just immigrants, threaten acceptable ways of being under these standards, these sort of white supremacist colonial standards, but also shift what acceptable ways of being are, specifically like how to speak English, which is, the most recognizable trait that I think we immediately know that it's Count Dracula when he's speaking because of his accent. And that's something that, you and I, Jasmine, can kind of understand and relate to, having people in our family be sort of like experience linguistic discrimination because of their accented English, and how there's like almost this panic around and also rigidity around how to speak English and like what the proper way to pronounce things are, what the proper grammar is, a symbol of how well you've assimilated. And vampires, even after being centuries, old and away from their home, they still maintain their accented English, their connection to this sort of to their homeland.
Mhm. I think that vampires, under threat of being like exposed, they must move in order to avoid detection and secure safety for themselves. And though perhaps physically stronger than humans, older than humans, more knowledgeable than them, they know that human violence is destructive and is a threat, even though they are immortal. They must try to blend in and hide these parts of themselves that may signal to the society that they're entering that they're not dangerous, if only to not attract the kind of attention that may have them harmed physically or otherwise. I think one family that does a really great job, maybe not that great of a job, are the Cullens. They maintain a facade of normalcy by entering like Forks society as a family unit,
Mm.
Carlisle as a career individual, and their pseudo children as students. But maybe they didn't do that great of a job because I don't know, they are still probably the most interesting thing, the most talked about family in their little town.
Very true. Very true. I would talk about them too. They're in my
Absolutely. And I think that maybe this is kind of like, even though they're trying so hard to assimilate and they can't, maybe it's because the vampiric nature is one that's inherently resistant to assimilation. They don't age or age slower than humans. They look different, they act different, and these things draw attention to how unnatural they seem to be despite their best efforts at blending in. Um, Humans, either subconsciously or knowingly, are able to perceive that there's something different about the Cullens or about these vampires. They are able to perceive their otherness. And when they can no longer shoulder this burden of otherness, then that's a signal that they must move rather than risk being exposed.
Mhm. When you were sort of talking about how vampires look different, they act different, they eat different things than humans do, they speak differently. I feel like, growing up in a as like a child of immigrants, that's, I also felt really different and in a lot of those similar ways, actually, which I feel like makes me understand the vampire a little bit more.
I think that like us as children of immigrants entering especially like a school setting where you feel so out of place,
Mhm.
feel so seen, like so visibly seen but not understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And also like especially sort of the time period in which we grew up, like what, early mid 2000s, that kind of era where there was a lot of very like Islamophobic and also anti-immigrant sentiment. And still today, like there's still this idea that there's immigrants like threaten our society. They like sort of like make American society worse, which I couldn't disagree with more, but that's sort of like the conditioning that we grew up with and also like still see super present, which I think also kind of takes us back to the vampire. And I don't have any supernatural abilities, even though that'd be cool. That'd be cool.
I think you could also make the argument that because like vampires are dis forever displaced like temporally, that even if they are inhabiting maybe a culture that's similar to theirs, it's never quite the same and they can never not necessarily get with the times, but they could be doing all the right things in order to integrate seamlessly into society, and they would still be noticed. And I think that's how I felt.
Mm.
Vampires, maybe they have like the supernatural thing going on me, maybe probably because of the way I appear, the color of my skin, and things like that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Outside of the Cullens, I think what's really interesting about Bram Stoker's Dracula specifically is that even though he is seen as, or we're reading him as like a British xenophobic response to the influx of Eastern European immigrants, he specifically is like a dire warning of what will happen if one fails to assimilate. It's a warning maybe to the immigrants that were entering British society in Bram Stoker's time, and us reading it now is maybe a warning to immigrants here in the United States. What happens if you are not able to hide everything that makes you different? So Dracula, who looks differently and behaves differently, he's such an obvious outsider to British society. And I think you were talking about this earlier, who that Brits decide who they are.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Like they decide who they are so they can discursively decide who the other also is. So if like British people decide that they're pure, civil, rational, they have to like project all of the sort of contrasting identities onto another people. And in sort of like reality, right? Like in our real history and real times, like that's often the people that they are colonizing, in order to justify the colonization of that people. So British people are white and pure, then the people they're colonizing are impure and dark-skinned. If British people are civil, then the people they're colonizing are uncivil, and so forth. If this process sounds familiar to you, it may be because you are familiar with Edward Said's seminal work, Orientalism. Said was a Palestinian American scholar and activist. His work, Orientalism, examines the ways in which the West views the East. Edward Said, in Orientalism, argues that the West creates a surrogate culture, society, people, which have to hold all of the undesirable qualities of the civil society. They define themselves only because they define the other two. Essentially, they say, I am only pure because they are impure. In the case of Dracula, they're also contrasting, like really binary forces. We see that the like British white folks, they identify as intelligent, rational, and they label the vampire Dracula as the opposite. There's like a real sense of good versus evil. And we can also really see this in the relationship between Count Dracula and Abraham Van Helsing.
I think that because Dracula could not mitigate his otherness the way the Cullens have, maybe because he couldn't, maybe because, which is so valid, he didn't necessarily have the desire to, he experiences the extreme consequence of failed assimilation, which is death, vis-a-vis Van Helsing.
The ultimate battle between good and evil.
The battle between the bad immigrant versus the model immigrant.
Right, right. Because Van Helsing himself is also an immigrant, but he embodies a very different type of immigrant than Dracula does.
Van Helsing is Dutch. He's a proper, in quotation marks, proper immigrant who's also a polymath. He lives this British ideal of a rational, educated, and learned man.
And Dracula, in comparison, seems to be on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Maybe most importantly in this story, Van Helsing is a Catholic.
Oh, yes! Yes!
And Dracula is like, we talked about this in part two, maybe the embodiment of sin itself, maybe the antithesis of religion itself. So there's good versus evil, Catholic versus like also evil.
Yeah, like he's his soul, Dracula's soul, is damned, is what I think most people would consider. Maybe vampires are just considered as like embodiments of sin, as monsters, just in this time period especially, are not redeemable, that they lack access to salvation.
I was reading this blog post by this blog called A Beautiful Book, and it's titled Vampires and Other Foreigners, written in 2019. And the author of this post really goes into these like binary processes here between Van Helsing and Dracula, talks about Van Helsing being, maybe even like model minority. And Dracula's like absolutely the opposite. He's, in quotes, corrupt, depraved, and religiously suspect.
Than Dracula, I think, as the embodiment of a mysterious Eastern European folktale that's maybe at odds or incongruent with Christianity, to see him being pitted against the epitome of the scientific, moral superiority by way of
Mhm.
Van Helsing, who is a doctor, lawyer, philosopher, all these other things. And Dracula loses. I think it can be summed up that he's being felled by a model minority, which is harrowing because what does that say about like immigrants who are perhaps not assimilating as well as they are expected to, and
Mhm.
how immigrants are often pitted against each other in order to kind of destroy any sense of solidarity against colonialism, against the colonial hegemonic
Mhm.
powers.
Yeah, absolutely. In contrast to the immigrant narrative around both Dracula and Van Helsing, for me, what comes up is the 2019 six-season run of What We Do in the Shadows TV show directed by Taika Waititi and Jay Clement, which was inspired by the 2014 movie. But specifically, the six-season run, they kind of leaned into exploring the vampire immigrant narrative. For those of you who don't know, the What We Do in the Shadows world at this point, right? It's like a mockumentary type thing, and then it was a full-length movie, and then it's six-season like TV show. But the whole world is kind of like a vampire comedy where they kind of don't take themselves so seriously. And it sort of follows like a handful of vampires that are like living in America in modern day, and they're like quite silly and incompetent, and they kind of like need to rely on their human familiar to sort of manage life. They originally came to New Jersey, the vampires, to, I don't know, take over the United States, and they're just like always failing at doing that. So it's quite like a silly, funny show, but also explores vampires and immigrants, like I think really in an interesting way. Two of the three or four like main vampires in the show are immigrants themselves. Nadja, I believe, is Romani, and Nandor is Irani. And they both maintain their accents, even though there's like sort of centuries that distance themselves from having lived in their homelands. And really key to this TV show is the character of Guillermo, who is Nandor's familiar, and they have a sort of a very interesting relationship with each other. And Tyler Dean wrote on Artform a piece called Things for the Memories and talks a bit about Guillermo. So, a little bit of spoilers ahead. So, if you haven't finished What We Do in the Shadows, let this be a warning to you. There's a little bit of spoilers. Um, yeah, it takes place in the United States, and the immigrant narrative is sort of about struggling to fit into a culture that despises you. That is what Tyler Dean writes. And Guillermo de la Cruz, he is, and I quote, a larger-bodied gay Chicano and child of immigrants. He understands what it's like to be an other in the United States. So Guillermo's stories, he becomes the familiar for Nandor because it is his like one big goal in life to become a vampire himself. And that is what carries us through to like all through the 6 seasons is him trying to gain a sense of power through becoming a vampire. And he makes it. He is able to become a vampire. There's some complicated stuff. He's also has a little Van Helsing. It's very interesting. I think you definitely should watch it. There's very interesting things going on here. They sort of like they sort of shift a lot of what we were talking about earlier, actually, between good and evil, between um Dracula, like, vampire versus Van Helsing in this one character in Guillermo. So I think it's pretty cool. So, but he makes this transition to becoming a vampire. And what something totally unexpected happens, which is he doesn't want it. And Tyler Dean, again, writes in his article called Things for the Memories on Artform, and I quote, there isn't a magic bullet to cure America's obsession with scapegoating the other, as even supernatural powers can't make one acceptable. And I think that is such a like that is so true for Guillermo. He's like really wanting to become a vampire in order to get power, but he at the end of the day he's like, you know what? Naja and Nandor, they're othered in a massive way too in this society. If you haven't watched What We Do in the Shadows, I think it's a really interesting show that does a lot of really interesting stuff, specifically with the immigrant narrative.
That was really uplifting.
It was very uplifting. I really do like it. I really
Yeah.
love it. It's so funny. It gives us like a totally different sort of like fresh take, I think, on like vampires. And I think a little later we'll talk more about like vampire media that doesn't center the white, experience. I know a lot of what we talked about is sort of filtered through that, but later on we'll talk about some stuff we're excited about in the vampire world that isn't that. And this is one of them. But yes, it was very uplifting. But, but in the end of part 2, if you're still listening, if you've made it all the way here and you're still listening, at the end of part 2, you'll remember that we promised in this section to talk about white women. What do white women have to do with the construction of the vampire? And after our short break, we'll let you know in part 3.5. What do immigrants, what do vampires have to do with white women?
Dun dun dun.
So you're joining us back from that short, short break to learn a little bit more about what is the role of white women in all of this? Why are they important? How did they come up? And why do we talk about immigrants first? Let's start off with, I think, a very interesting quote again in this blog post that I found very interesting that will be linked wherever we can link it. The blog is called A Beautiful Book. The title is Vampires and Other Foreigners, written in 2019. And the author writes, the vampire myth can also be read as a sexual allegory in which female virtue is menaced by foreign predators.
Vampires, when it was written in 1897 during Bram Stoker's publication of Dracula, vampires threatened Victorian sensibilities of what it meant to be a white woman. There's this fear of sexual corruption, of domestic corruption, of where women existed in society, where their value was kind of placed on their ability to make a home, their sexual purity, their innocence, all of these things.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there is this very specific way that uh, like this creation of the monster that is the vampire in Dracula that also has set like a tone for the vampire genre, and also other sort of like monster genres, right? Like this specific targeting of white women to sort of specifically target their like white womanhood, which is their sort of virtue. So like Dracula is preying on uh, Mina and also Lucy. In a show like True Blood, Bill is preying on Sookie. White women sort of represent racial and sexual purity within the cultural context that they exist in. So I think you could argue that both Mina and Sookie sort of represent this racial and sexual purity. The monster then threatens their that purity because they're vying for control and affection and attention, specifically of this white woman that represents purity. She is at the center of the construction of the monster, and in this case, the vampire. Women often, unfortunately, I would say, represent the society and culture at large. And there, again, I keep using this word, but there is this large emphasis on purity and how that works racially and sexually for white women. The monster, the vampire, threatens this primarily sexually, copulating, fixating, feeding on her, and even turning her into a vampire. So the ultimate loss of virtue of the white women is the loss of virtue of the overall society. And that is why, like, not, oftentimes a vampire is like preying upon sort of like everyone, but it's usually mostly women.
Mhm.
Although the vampire still is this figure that is like terrifying to everyone because of what the vampire represents, which is like the decay and loss of like a way of being, an acceptable way of being in a civil society, but also this loss of virtue. Specifically in Dracula, there are two women that are central to the story, um, Mina and Lucy. So Lucy is not like the sort of main subject of the story, but she plays an important role in telling us about sort of like attitudes at the time of like a English woman. She represents the new woman. Again, if you want to read more about it, it's in blog post, Vampires and Other Foreigners. But she's sort of like very sexually uh, forward. She's very like outgoing. She has like a really different personality than her counterpart, Mina. And she also, because of her like uh, sensuality, it's almost like she is susceptible to this attack. Mina, on the other hand, is instead of representing like the new woman, represents like very Victorian, traditional femininity. And based on the adaptation you're viewing, Mina, or whatever that character is named in that adaptation, is very repelled by Dracula and is putting up this constant fight. We really saw that in the 2025 Nosferatu. She's really like trying to push away the vampire. But in other adaptations, like in the 1992 Coppola's version, she definitely has like more, there's like complexity there in terms of like her agency, her sense of agency. They sort of represent different things, but they, at the end of the day, they both represent a different type of white womanhood. And Lucy really serves as a, what would you say? She serves as sort of like an example to
Hmm.
fear. Like if you
Like a
uh
warning of
a
sorts.
warning of yeah, like if you embody this new woman, you'll like she is so she is like so preyed upon in that novel. Like, I feel so bad for her. Like she is ultimately turned into a vampire, like the absolute loss of herself and these Victorian sensibilities, what it means to be a woman. But Mina, on the other hand, while she represents this old school sensibilities in the original text, she's like doesn't want the vampire. She feels like forced and she is like disgusted almost by the vampire, um, which just supports her maintaining her virtue at the end of the day. But I would say it's like maybe even more interesting in the 1992 version where we're a little unsure of where she stands.
White women as kind of gatekeepers to the purity of society, the purity of race. I think what's so harrowing is that even though women are marginalized at every turn, at most turns in the Victorian age, they have this pull in that if a woman does become corrupted, it is kind of expected that they will pull down everyone else with them into eternal damnation. Which is why I think that these newer adaptations of vampire romance, specifically when vampires are able to be redeemed, when they receive salvation through love, they primarily are looking for salvation through white women. A lot of their media right now, not right now, actually, previous, maybe 10 years ago, circa the heyday of Twilight, a lot of the vampire romance audience was driven by white women who I think in their kind of struggle against what they feel against their like constraints, they really embraced this forbidden romance.
There's a way that like, the original text of Dracula, the vampire is fixated on the white women, and it's something that is like it's like, it's fearful.
Mhm.
It's very much written like an attack. And we kind of also see that in like the newer Nosferatu by Robert Eggers. Like it feels like an attack. But then we talked about the construction and the evolution of the vampire becoming a viable romantic interest. And they're humanizing the monster. They're complicating the monster's intentions and their place in the world. And I think with that, like in Twilight, Edward fixating on Bella, yeah, there's like the predator and prey dynamic, but there's also the dynamics of desirability in which choosing this like plain Jane white gal um, tells us something now about the politics of desirability, which is that white women are desirable. So white women are at least what they represent, in terms of racial and sexual purity, all that creepy, nasty stuff, um, are sort of at the center. of some of the original iterations and creation of the vampire. Vampires are considered these foreign predators that are threatening white women, just like immigrants are thought to threaten white women. That is essentially a really similar narrative to a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric that I think we see and are maybe familiar with, like immigrant men, men of color are often sort of portrayed in like a similar monstrous light that like threaten white, specifically white womanhood. And that has sort of created and even justified legislation that like over police this specific population.
Conclusion. We've explored the enticing and alluring world of the vampire. And on this journey, we've spoken about the making of a monster, the utility of viewing monstrous literature through an immigrant, post-colonial lens, despite its misgivings. We've spoken about the evolution of the monster, of the vampire, from monster to viable romantic partner. We've also spoken about how vampires embody sin itself. And lastly, we've discussed the vampire as an immigrant and the at times harrowing real-world systemic consequences of othering.
Through the vampire, we've been able to explore trauma, queerness, immigration, othering in exciting, contradictory, and even painful ways. To engage with the vampire through this specific lens requires work on the end of the reader or viewer or consumer to make sense of the oftentimes flawed and problematic literature that exists to us. Though much of the media we have anchored this exploration in is indisputably white, I see so much potential to use the vampire to explore experiences of color, which is why we would like to leave you with some recommendations of POC vampire media that we're particularly excited about. On the top of our list is Sinners.
At the production of this podcast, it has just been released in theaters, so we've not had the opportunity to view it quite yet.
Next is a movie called A Girl Walks Alone at Night. This explores, like, the imagery of this movie looks incredible. It's been out for some time. We see the vampire as a Muslim woman in like a hijab and a baya, and I think it's originally it's based on a graphic novel. So very excited to view that. Season 3 of Interviewing the Vampire. Very excited about that. And this one's kind of an old one, but Queen of the Damned. There's a strong possibility of us doing a future episode on POC vampire media exclusively. So if you want to see that, definitely let us know.
It is the infinite possibilities of vampires and our reading of them, our relation and interest in them, our fear and revulsion of them that allow these undead creatures of the night to survive the fickleness of trend cycles. From Dracula to Twilight and beyond, the way vampires evolve and are reinvented to confront whatever it is at the forefront of our experience speaks specifically to our desire to creatively engage with the world around us, especially for those of us who may exist in the margins.
So, who is the vampire? To us, a lonely, misunderstood, born from trauma, oftentimes queer immigrant embodying all of the things that a civilized society warns us about. And that is a sympathetic creature.